It seems to me that Aunty Bev's going to be looking for an out, and Lally certainly didn't give her one. So I decided to chase up the Odell case to look into where she might find her out, and I do believe I have found it. So let's have a look at it, shall we? Without going into too much detail, let's quickly skim over the Odell motion. It comes from Commonwealth versus James Odell. In that motion, it was put where a police officer testified before a grand jury that the defendant made a statement incriminating himself as the driver of a vehicle in which a companion accused of having committed an armed robbery fled the scene of the crime, but the officer failed to inform the grand jury about portions of the statement in which the defendant denied knowing that his companion had intended to commit or had committed an armed robbery. The integrity of the grand jury proceeding was impaired by the misleading presentation, requiring dismissal of the indictment. Judicial review of the competency or sufficiency of evidence before a grand jury is limited to consideration of the sufficiency of the evidence to establish the identity of the accused and probable cause to arrest him. So that was what was put to this court. O'Connor ruled the defendant was indicted for the armed robbery of a convenience store in the city of Salem. The indictment was dismissed by a judge of the Superior Court. On appeal by the Commonwealth, the appeals court reversed. We allowed the defendant's application for further appellate review. We affirmed the order of the Superior Court. The indictment was dismissed pursuant to a motion of the defendant, which asserted that the evidence before the grand jury was insufficient to support an indictment and that the prosecutor improperly withheld exculpatory evidence from the grand jury. The judge ruled that the evidence before the grand jury was insufficient to support an indictment. He did not reach the issue whether the prosecutor violated a duty to present exculpatory evidence. So essentially, this ruling was never about whether the prosecutor failed to present exculpatory evidence. The Commonwealth appealed, and the appeals court, by a summary disposition, reversed the order dismissing the indictment. Commonwealth versus Odell, 1983. The appeals court's order stated that the evidence was more than sufficient to establish the identity of the defendant and probable cause to arrest him, citing Commonwealth versus McCarthy, 1982. The order further stated that the prosecutor had no duty to place before the grand jury evidence which is claimed to be exculpatory, citing Commonwealth versus McJunkin in 1981. The defendant argues that the evidence presented to the grand jury did not warrant a finding of probable cause to arrest him, and that therefore it was insufficient to support the indictment in accordance with the minimum standard articulated in Commonwealth versus McCarthy. He also argues that the standard by which the sufficiency of the evidence to warrant an indictment should be measured is its sufficiency to warrant a finding of guilt rather than its sufficiency to warrant a finding of probable cause to arrest. In addition, the defendant argues in his brief that we should require that the evidence relied on be such that it would be admissible over objection at trial. The defendant orally argued before us that if we were unwilling to hold that the evidence necessary to support an indictment must be of such nature that it would withstand objection at trial. At least we should hold that to sustain an indictment there must be some evidence, whether competent or not, which, if believed, would rationally permit a finding of the defendant's guilt. Lastly, the defendant argues that the prosecutor improperly withheld exculpatory evidence from the grand jury. Our affirmance of the dismissal of the indictment results from our conclusion that the integrity of the grand jury proceeding was impaired by an unfair and misleading presentation to the grand jury of this is an important part, of a portion of a statement attributed to the defendant without revealing that an exculpatory portion of the purported statement had been excised. So they only told part of the statement, not the whole statement. We do not announce a rule that would require prosecutors in all instances to bring exculpatory evidence to the attention of grand juries. We're satisfied in this case, however, that the withholding of a portion of the defendant's statement distorted the portion that was repeated to the grand jury in a way that so seriously tainted the presentation to that body that the indictment should not have been allowed to stand. The indictment is to be dismissed, therefore, but without prejudice to the right of the Commonwealth to seek a new indictment. That's really all we need to know about this. What they're saying is that if we look back at the beginning of the document, the defendant had made a statement incriminating himself as the driver of a vehicle in which a companion accused of having committed an armed robbery fled the scene of the crime. But the part that was left out is where the defendant denied knowing that his companion had intended to commit or had committed an armed robbery when he drove away with the accused in the vehicle with him. And so, having only told the incriminating part that he was the driver of the vehicle, leaving out the exculpatory part of the very same statement, these weren't two separate statements or two different interviews, these were all part of the same statement. This is important to note. Knowing that his companion had intended to commit or had committed an armed robbery, he denied that part. And so that's why I think Aunty Bev's going to come back and say, no, this doesn't meet the Odell ruling, because it doesn't match the exculpatory evidence described by Jackson that was put to the grand jury. There was no, single one statement where part of it was left out that changed the appearance of what was said. If the police officer was to have said, I have no relationship to these people other than blah, 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 and what was presented to this grand jury was the first part, I have no relationship to these people, but the last part was left out, then this might be a match to the Odell motion, but I don't see that Jackson actually made that connection in his pleading. There's probably multiple other areas where Aunty Bev could find her out, but I'm pretty sure that it's going to come down to this tiny little difference. Having said that, I also think that Karen Reid's team are playing the long game. It doesn't start and end with motions to dismiss or even motions to sanction. They also need to be prepared for the event that it does go to trial. And in the event that it does go to trial and a conviction is secured, they also need to be prepared for the appeals process. As we've seen so far, there's a lot of moving parts, and we've still got a couple more hearings yet before we actually go to trial, so there may well be even more moving parts added to the equation. Anyway, what happens between now and trial, and then from trial to appeal, are all on the game board. When it comes time to appeal, the defence is going to have this whole list of improprieties, Brady violations, and unsanctioned activities that they can choose from to take it through to appeal. And Aunty Bev won't have a say over what the appellate courts rule. I personally think the strongest argument for dismissal that was made was destruction of evidence. Of course, Aunty Bev may foresee this, so she may apply a sanction, which is found under general rules of the court, under section 13E, item B, whoever alters, destroys, mutilates or conceals a record, document or other object or attempts to do so with the intent to impair the record, document or object's integrity or availability for use in an official proceeding, whether or not the proceeding is pending at the time, shall be punished by 1. A fine of not more than $10,000 or by imprisonment in the state prison and so on. Of course, Bev will just go for the lowest there, $5,000 fine. That's my prediction. However, in the case of Commonwealth versus Sassville, the court did find that gross negligence on the part of the police in destroying or losing evidence could be enough to warrant dismissal. I don't want to read the case because it covers topics that YouTube's not friendly with. However, the court ruled the gross negligence of the Commonwealth combined with the irreplaceable nature of the evidence warranted dismissal because essentially it prevented the defendant from impeaching the witness. In its judgment, the court pointed out the culpability of the Commonwealth They said, considering the Commonwealth's conduct in this matter, we disagree with the judge's characterisation of the Commonwealth's culpability as at best negligent. They did describe why, but we have to talk about the sensitive nature of the case. Just to jump forward a bit, they say, therefore, considering all the circumstances in this extraordinary case, we rule that the culpability of the Commonwealth amounted to a rare case of gross negligence and in fact comes perilously close to supporting an inference of bad faith. And they also gave B, materiality of the destroyed evidence. They said that the basis for the defendant's arrest and subsequent indictment was the complainant's statement made to the police and others. Obviously, as the key prosecution witness, her credibility was of major importance. So having access to this evidence to impeach her was therefore highly material. And then C, prejudice to the defendant. So in the case where it potentially deprived him of an opportunity to impeach the witness's credibility, in a case that appears to turn on the credibility of the victim, where destroyed evidence is determined to be material, it is nevertheless unlikely that the prejudice to the defendant will be high where there is additional sufficient evidence upon which to convict him. Here, the only evidence that certain things occurred was the destroyed evidence. There was no other evidence upon which the defendant could be convicted. Further, where the defendant is essentially precluded from presenting a defence, the prejudice is greater. The defendant's ability to impeach the witness was critical to the defendant's defence. It was, in fact, in this case, his only defence. Anyway, it goes on to talk about the remedy, where a court finds that the Commonwealth failed to disclose exculpatory evidence that is material and the non-disclosure was prejudicial to the defendant. A new trial may be ordered, but when potentially exculpatory evidence has been lost or destroyed, and that evidence is material and its absence creates a possibility of prejudice, a court is faced with a troubling choice. It can attempt to fashion a remedy to ensure that the defendant, despite the loss or destruction of evidence, receives a fair trial, or, if the circumstances warrant it, order the indictment to be dismissed. Here, because of the Commonwealth's conduct, the defendant was compelled to make a choice between two alternatives. He could either question the witness at trial, question about and comment upon the Commonwealth's failure to produce the evidence, or have all evidence regarding that topic suppressed. In the circumstances of this case, we rule that neither choice would have provided the defendant with a fair trial. The purpose of the choices presented to the defendant by the motion judge was remedial, to ensure that the defendant would receive a fair trial despite the Commonwealth's conduct in allowing the evidence to be destroyed. However, although the defendant was purportedly offered two choices, in fact, neither option presented the required remedial benefit. So if the defendant had selected the first choice, he was screwed, and if he chose the second choice, he was screwed as well, is essentially what they're saying. We recognise that absent egregious misconduct, or at least a serious threat of prejudice, the remedy of dismissal infringes too severely on the public interest in bringing guilty persons to justice. However, we rule, in view of the Commonwealth's conduct and the resulting strong possibility of prejudice to the defendant, the harm to him was irremediable. Therefore, the defendant's motion to dismiss the indictment should have been allowed. In conclusion, in order to reach our decision, we have, as in all cases of this type, been forced to engage in speculation in regards to the question whether the destroyed evidence was potentially exculpatory. We're required to do so because otherwise the disclosure duty established by Brady and its progeny would be converted into an empty promise, easily circumvented by suppression of evidence by means of destruction rather than mere failure to reveal. So what kind of evidence, I wonder, could possibly fall into egregious misconduct or a serious threat of prejudice that might cause irremediable harm to Karen Reid? What kind of evidence might have been destroyed as a means of circumventing production of evidence rather than a mere failure to reveal? I would posit that the lack of metadata proving when this photo was taken might indeed fit into this category. particularly if the device that it was taken with is one of the devices that DA Morrissey gave the green light to destroy. The judges in the Commonwealth versus Sassville made sure to note that they didn't intend for their decision to cast a wide net. But similarly to that case, if Karen Reid can't prove the order in which events occurred, like when the taillight was actually broken, specifically because those devices were destroyed and the metadata associated with this photo no longer exists, and that absent that evidence there was not sufficient other evidence with which to convict her, then Aunty Bev sanctioning the prosecution for a lousy couple of grand or whatever could possibly seal the fate of this case being overturned at appeal. So, raise your hand in the comments if you think Aunty Bev is going to fall for a negligent at best sanction against the Commonwealth.